Welcome to Scope. I'm Waqar Rizvi. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We're going to discuss in this first segment of the show, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK has spoken to the Queen, and she has made the decision to suspend Parliament, called prorogation there in the UK. This will happen just days after MPs return to work in September, after their recess there is over. The whole country, and in fact many of the international community, or many in the international community, I should say, have come out in condemnation of this move, saying it is against democratic values. The suspension of Parliament will last for about 5 weeks. What does this mean for Brexit? Most importantly, considering, of course, the Brexit deadline is October 31st, Johnson saying, of course, that the UK will, do or die, leave the EU on October 31st. What does this mean? Does this mean that essentially he's guaranteed a no-deal Brexit to occur, or will there be a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson before that takes place? And then what does that mean as well? Does that mean that there will be a general election before Brexit, or will all of this happen beyond that deadline? A lot of confusion, of course, and let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Henry Bolton, who is a former Army officer, police officer, and diplomat. He's the founder and present leader, of the Our Nation Party of Great Britain. He's joining us now from London. And we're also joined by Dr. Martin Farr, who is a UK historian. He's a senior lecturer in contemporary British history at Newcastle University. He's joining us now from Cambridge. Martin and Henry, thank you both for your time today. Martin, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this decision to suspend Parliament? Is it just like it seems to the rest of us on the outside, that this is all about Brexit?
Essentially, yes. And the banner you had on screen just now, the suspension of Parliament, demonstrates just what a dramatic event this is. Nothing unconstitutional has happened, nothing illegal has happened. The Queen has followed convention and followed precedent, and she's followed the advice of her First Minister. But certainly this is being used for political purposes, and it demonstrates the seriousness of the Prime Minister and of his government to pursue Brexit by October the 31st, to the end possibly of a no-deal exit, which neither he nor the government wants to happen. And so I think by this initiative, he's forcing the issue. And in a way, it makes no-deal Brexit possibly less likely, because
but Martin, if I may come in for a moment, when you say that Boris does not want a no-deal Brexit, the cynics, or there are many of them out there, as you well know, Martin, would say that in fact he is fine with a no-deal Brexit. What do you make of that?
I think the convulsions nationally in terms of the economy, in terms of day-to-day life, in terms of the borders, would be so great that no Prime Minister could possibly wish for a no-deal Brexit to take place. And indeed, very few parliamentarians actually would prefer a no-deal Brexit. The vast majority of Conservative MPs, the vast majority of MPs who are prepared to support leaving, which is the majority, would rather have it with a deal. And by demonstrating the lengths to which he will go to ensure that Britain leaves on October the 31st, he may focus minds both in Parliament and in Europe about the necessity of agreeing a deal which he can get through the House of Commons. Okay,
so then, Henry, all this noise about how this essentially guarantees a no-deal Brexit, et cetera, and that seems to be the narrative, at least, that is growing. Do you think that's wrong? Do you agree with Martin that this is, in fact, Boris Johnson just, trying to tactfully force Parliament to actually agree upon a deal?
Well, I think we ought to ask ourselves first, if I may, what do we mean by a deal? The reality is that there are a number of agreements, technical agreements, that are already in place, already signed and sealed, and will continue to be after the 31st of October, even if nothing else is agreed. And some of those rest within international law. Some of them are between the UK and the European Union already. So, for example, our aircraft are still going to be able to land at in European mainland airports and so on. So there is no such thing as no deal. The phrase no deal really, in my view, came about because of Theresa May's efforts to produce what ended up being the withdrawal agreement, which Parliament voted on 3 times and rejected 3 times. That effectively was a treaty. It was an all-encompassing single agreement in treaty form, effectively, in terms of its practical impact. that, it wrapped everything up. Now, if that's what we're talking about in terms of a deal, I think it's intrinsically bad for the country because it ties us to a certain extent to European Union foreign policy, defence policy, and trade policy.
Yeah.
Do we want that sort of deal? And I would argue no, and I think Boris Johnson doesn't want it either. But Boris Johnson had a bit of a conundrum, didn't he? We had a date of the 31st of October on which we leave, but there is another party over here called the Brexit Party, which has been holding his feet to the flames on that.
Yeah.
Really threatening to undermine the Conservative Party if indeed they do not take us out of the European Union on the 31st of October. So Boris really had to adopt that date for his target date for leaving. But he also has people in his own party who are absolutely determined that we should leave with some sort of agreement. Now, they don't necessarily even understand. Many of our politicians don't even understand what's going on at the moment. But they don't necessarily understand that we've already got some agreements in place. They want an all-encompassing sort of deal.
Yeah.
And so Boris Johnson, having very little time now between...
exactly. On that point of time, Henry, because he sort of put himself in more of a corner, hasn't he? I mean, I'm really failing to understand the logic of suspending Parliament at this time. If time is so short till October 31st, how on earth does suspending Parliament help any of the above? He's
actually, government continues to function. And indeed, not only is what he's done constitutional, but it happens sort of just about every year at this time of year. And indeed, a new government, a new prime minister, new government, it's normal practice for them to ask for a suspension of Parliament for a few weeks until followed by a Queen's speech. And we also have to remember that the Queen will, when Parliament comes back on the 14th of October, there will be a Queen's speech. I think it's due for the 17th of October, in which the Queen will lay out the agenda for the government.
Yeah. And
there will be a debate in Parliament. And I'm quite sure the Queen will refer to our departure from the European Union in her speech on the 17th. There will then be a debate in Parliament, and Parliament has to vote on the Queen's speech. And that, in a sense, is a vote of confidence in the agenda of the government.
Vote of no confidence, do you think that this will occur before Brexit occurs on October 31st, or will this happen after? Is it actually needed at this time? Because, I'm looking right now, as we're speaking, Henry, at this petition, Do Not Prorogue Parliament, and the numbers continue to go up drastically. And then even the polls show that the British people are not supportive of suspending Parliament at this time, at this sensitive juncture right before Brexit.
Well, I mean, the polls I'm looking at, I'm afraid, say the opposite. That people are, to solve this, to get this situation clarified, one way or the other.
I'm looking at the YouGov poll, Henry. I'm not sure which poll you're looking at. The YouGov poll says 27% of Britons, only 27% of Britain, are in support of Johnson's suspension of the UK Parliament. Right.
Well, I think there are a number of polls and everybody's scrabbling around for polls at the moment. I mean, if I can go back to your point about the vote of no confidence.
Sure.
If I may, I'm sure there will be a vote of no confidence in some form. It will either be that the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, tables a vote of no confidence in the few days that Parliament sits before now its suspension, because Parliament is coming back to sit again on the 3rd of September. So it may be that Jeremy Corbyn in those days, 3rd, 4th of September, will table a vote of no confidence in the government. However, I think it would be a little strange for him to do that, because in essence, the vote on the Queen's speech, as I said earlier, which is laying out the government's agenda for its work, is Parliament votes on that, and they vote to support that agenda. If they vote not to support that agenda, effectively it's a vote of no confidence in the government.
Okay, so Martin is back with us, Henry. I do apologize for cutting you off. I wanted to get Martin's thoughts on that, now that you're back with us, about a vote of no confidence possibly taking place. What does that mean? Because, Martin, one of the things that I've heard consistently ever since I've been covering Brexit on this show is that everyone's just afraid of having Corbyn as prime minister, and they'll do anything in their power, it seems at least, the establishment, if I may use that term, to not have Corbyn in power, and they would just rather not have that sort of vote of no confidence take place even at this time?
Waqar, you couldn't have constructed a situation which was more dysfunctional than one we find ourselves in, both in terms of an election being called and a government losing its majority, in terms of the narrowness of the vote of the referendum in the first place, and then for the leader of the opposition, who constitutionally, by convention, is the first person who should be invited to form a government in the event of a government falling, is such a toxic character with many of his own MPs, never mind other members of other parties, and so is certainly not the character or the individual to present a government of national unity. And so the idea of version no confidence, which is part of the 2011 Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and that's relevant because what we're seeing over the course of the last 20 years or so is the accretion, the creation of all sorts of aspects of the Constitution, which were once based on convention and precedent, are now being codified. And so there are restrictions which didn't used to exist, which make it harder than in the past to unseat a government and to present a new prime minister. Even before Jeremy Corbyn, whose own position on Brexit has been quite an ambivalent one. So it couldn't be a more dysfunctional situation than we find ourselves in, both in terms of the government and in terms of an alternative.
I wonder, Martin, and I'm going to ask you this question. I know it's a very direct one, and you've already alluded to what you would answer to this, but I wonder, after such time has already passed since the Brexit vote took place. I mean, there's that term that's been floating around for a while, that Brexit fatigue. I mean, I'm sure somebody like you who's been covering Brexit and researching it as well is probably at some level tired of this entire affair. Is a no-deal Brexit really that bad, considering Britons did vote for Brexit to occur? MPs have not been able to agree throughout these years on the deal. Why not just then, make a hard exit?
One of the themes of the last 3 years has been a disconnect between so-called experts, so-called elites and leaders, and the public. This was manifested in the referendum itself, when those who recommended remaining for fear of there being great economic dislocations were presented as Project Fear. And that remains the case now, that the alarm that suggested if we were to leave without a deal could be exaggerated on the part of people who have an interest in trying to thwart Brexit. So this disconnect has been great and it's been growing. And I think the essential feature of Johnson's initiative yesterday is essentially to go beyond the public and to go beyond commentators and academics and politicians and to deal directly with the public, who, as you say, are definitely showing signs of Brexit fatigue and wanting this matter to be dealt with as quickly as possible.
Just before I let you both go, Henry, I'm just going to take a bit of extra time from our producer. I want your thoughts as well on that, Henry, about a no-deal Brexit. Is it really that bad? In just under a minute, please.
Well, as I said earlier, there are a number of technical frameworks and agreements in place which do mitigate it. So there's no such thing as absolutely no deal.
Okay.
And indeed, the concept that actually the United Kingdom is going to be cut off from the rest of Europe is really quite, it's simply unrealistic. Right. So I think, the no deal is not ideal. The more agreements that we have in place before we leave the European Union, the better for all concerned. But I do think that if we leave without any further agreements in place, then we will get through it. I mean, we are a country with a great deal going for it. The European Union wants to trade with us. They want to work with us on security and defence. We want to cooperate with them. And so the only obstacle here is not one of practicality or economics or ordinary people being motivated to work together. It is simply one of politics between the European Union and a country that...
On that optimistic note then from Henry, we're going to have to thank both Henry and Martin for their time and, of course, for their expert insight on this confusing subject, really, viewers. I've been covering Brexit for a while, as you know, here in this show, and it only gets more confusing. It seems that, of course, the narrative that has come out in the mainstream, at least, about what Boris Johnson has done seems to be a bit misplaced. There's a lot of hype about what is going on, even some people throwing words around like this is constitutionally illegitimate, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, saying that the Queen has been put into an awkward position. But is this really awkward? He certainly has the right to do this, and everyone says, as our guest did as well, around this time of the year, Parliament is suspended, possibly not for this long, and at a sensitive time like Brexit, it may not have been the best idea, or maybe it was the best idea. Maybe it'll force MPs to finally put their heads together and come to a deal or agree upon a deal that the EU would also accept. We'll keep a very close eye on how this develops in the coming days, months, or actually just days and weeks, I should say, till October 31st and that deadline here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Thank you, viewers, for staying with us here in Scope. I'm Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss in this segment the proposal, the Iranian proposal, I should say, for an Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline, i.e. a pipeline stretching from Iran all the way to Syria. It would obviously go through Iraq, and that would be, obviously, as one can imagine, contentious and would anger the United States greatly, especially at the sensitive time as the tensions are high within this region, as you well know, surrounding the Strait of Hormuz and otherwise. The Iraqis, as well as the Iranians, would obviously benefit at some level from having a plan B to circumvent the Strait of Hormuz. And otherwise, Europe may very well like such an idea as well, because Europe would probably benefit in that it would not need to use tankers or otherwise to be able to get energy needs, which of course are growing in that region of the world. But it's obviously not that simple, considering sanctions on Iran and as well, of course, but Iraq's desire to be and to remain far from any tensions between the United States and Iran. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Abdoun, who is a geopolitical analyst in an oil gas consulting firm. He specializes in the Middle East, North Africa region, and he includes, of course, an expertise in energy markets. He's joining us now, I should say, from Brussels. We're also joined by Cyril Widdershoven, who is an energy expert. He's the director of the Dutch consultancy Verasi. He's joining us now from Arnhem in Netherlands. And we're also joined by Alessandro Bacci, who is an international energy specialist. He's an upstream fiscal analyst at Global Data. He's joining us now from the Balearic Islands in Spain. Alessandro, Anas, and Cyril, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Cyril, I'd like to start with you because one of the reasons I came across this topic was an article that you wrote for oilprice.com, and I'm sure, of course, our other guests have been following this story closely as well. Just give us your viewpoint on whether you think this pipeline would be a good idea, if it's even really feasible, considering the political ramifications.
For the Iranians, it's a good idea because they are running out of options. However, the feasibility of the project right at the moment that the U.S. is increasing sanctions and becoming more harsh on every single aspect with Iran, I think that to propose a project which will not only go via Iraq, but also via Syria, will be for sure a hot issue for anyone in the US and in the Arab world, because of course it's not only the US that will be having an eye on it, but Saudi, the UAE, Egypt, and the other ones will also have their ideas.
Yeah.
On the Iraqi front, it will increase possible pressure from the US on the Iraqis, and that comes at a time that there are already growing issues. Iraqi militias are warning the US when they are acting against Iran. There are already actions.
Indeed. So let me put this into Alessandro. Alessandro, when obviously then one and your line of work, of course, puts forth a risk analysis, I imagine this is just filled with a risk, and I imagine any client would be told this is just not a good idea. But at the same time, I wonder, with the tensions of Strait of Hormuz and otherwise, what options really then exist for the likes of Iran, Iraq, and even Syria, even in the midst of the fact that it is possibly just slowly coming out of a very long-standing war in that country? What options exist other than such a pipeline?
Well, the point is that there are not many alternatives. There are not many options. The Strait of Hormuz is too important. So my idea is that normally we can add some pipelines. We can give more economic flexibility. but it's a temporary solution because in case there is limited accessibility to the Strait of Hormuz or a closure, that would be an economic problem, huge problem. Consider that now we are talking about oil, but also approximately 1/4 of the LNG, has to be shipped across the Strait of Hormuz. So imagine a world where you have, less oil available because you use pipelines to export this oil. Then you have the impossibility of exporting LNG from liquefied gas, natural gas, from the Strait of Hormuz. So it would be a huge problem. So my point of view is that normally we can have more flexibility, and this is what, the economic flexibility, all the countries that are trying to have to find a way to export. But at the same time, we have to consider that, a real solution. Saudi Arabia is talking to increasing the capacity of its East-West pipeline, which is the pipeline for transporting oil from the Persian Gulf to Yanbu on the Red Sea. But these are just small helpers. These are small attempts. The Strait of Hormuz is literally it's a waterway. It's probably the most important waterway in the world. So it's not easy to find alternatives.
Okay, so Anas, what are your thoughts about that? Because obviously this comes in the context, as our other guests mentioned, of course, about the tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, but then also, of course, this maximum pressure campaign that the U.S. has been, using right now against Iran to try to zero its oil exports. Do you think that this is heading towards Iran's oil exports being zeroed at any level? Because obviously the Iranians would fight that till the end, wouldn't they?
Yeah, if we see the project in a pure economic vision, we can see like it's a win-win project. It's an opportunity for Iran to secure the transport of its oil up to Syria, as we've seen the last few weeks ago that Iranian oil takers was stopped by a British Navy in the Strait of Gibraltar. So that it's more a strategic a vision to try to bypass this international sanction more than economic vision. I mean, the consumption of oil in Syria is around 200,000 barrels per day. And I saw that this pipeline projected to 1.2 billion barrels per day. So it's economically not that interesting, but in terms of strategic, it's pretty interesting for Iran. The other things regarding to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, which is actually, there is a lot of tension over there. Yeah. I'm not sure that it's a great strategy, because if we see the Iraqi exports, for instance, 60% of crude exports, Iraqi crude exports, are going to Asia and not in the west part of Iraq. And that is the same thing for Iran. Before the American sanction, 80% of Iraqi export was to Asia, and now I think we are more than 90%. So try to find out some niche market to export. They can help, but it's not a long-term solution in economic point of view and also in a geopolitical point of view, for sure.
Cyril, I wonder, sitting in Europe, all through Europe, in fact, I wonder the European point of view on its energy needs is certainly, of course, an important one, because, with the Russia sanctions, we know how many countries are still using Russian energy because they're just so dependent on it, and there are just not that many alternatives out there for Europe. Then if the Iranians are completely cut off as well, as the U.S. so wants, what is Europe to do? So I wonder if you think at some level that Europe may actually stand up, as it's trying to, or at least it's saying it's trying to, when it comes to the nuclear deal, for example, as well.
That's a real issue. First of all, the need for oil in the EU is not extremely high. Okay. Yeah, so demand for oil is flat, and most of the oil, even that there are sanctions on Russia, European oil is either Russian oil or oil now from the US. Will the EU stand up? I do not honestly think that the EU is able to stand up and say, well, we will deal with Iran, whatever the US says. Second of all, the EU is not one big entity, and the Germans are having another view than the English. The Dutch are something else. So we are trying to keep to the commitment of the JCPOA, even that there is a growing feeling within Europe that the JCPOA, like it is, should be changed. However, there is another feeling in the EU. We are the EU, so we should make clear that we are not only following the US and whatever they say. And this is where Iran is having a point. They are still able to use the EU in a way that without the EU doing anything in reality, because up to now the EU didn't do anything at all. Yeah,
okay, so on that point then, Alessandro, I want to put that to you, because that's an important point. And as Cyril there correctly said, the Iranians keep bringing it up. And in fact, it is a question that I imagine a lot of people, even in the EU, have in mind, that is the EU always just a US stooge when it comes to such matters? Will it be able to stand up for itself, even if it just comes to the nuclear deal, whether it's just to use this energy and, for example, a pipeline like this, if in the hypothetical situation goes through, just to convince Iran to stay within the nuclear deal? Do you think the EU has that political will?
It's difficult because the American power is so strong. Actually, the European countries have tried in the previous months to establish an SPV, a special purpose vehicle. The name is Instex, and this is actually a sort of tool that they're trying to use for continuing to do business with Iran, and it's based on barter. The only thing is that actually it's not easy because I repeat, the American presidency is very strong and actually very willing to stop all the attempts to try to involve more Iran into the international trade. So I don't understand now whether, I don't know exactly whether the EU has the sufficient power to actually support business with Iran. They're trying to do something, honestly, and this Instex will probably be a sort of one of the first tools that they want to implement. But still, the future is really unpredictable.
Okay, so Anas, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because the Iranians would say, as you know well, Anas, that the EU has not done enough, even though the most recent meeting, I believe, Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran came out fairly happy, saying that there was some progress in that surprise visit he made to the G7 summit in Biarritz. Do you think that the EU will be able to hold on to this nuclear deal somehow, will still be able to possibly even import Iranian energy?
Well, we saw in the last summit, the G7 summit, that Mohammed Javad Zarif was invited in that summit, and that European countries really wanted to save the JCPOA deal. There is no doubt about that. But the fact is that the idea to import the Iranian oil by pipeline will be cheaper than by oil tankers. So the oil, the Iranian oil will be maybe more attractive to the European market. I don't think that it's a good analysis, honestly, because of course the price will be more attractive. But when it's come to Europe, here in European countries, it's oil companies who import oil needs, right? And these oil companies have major interests around the world, and they all remember this case when a French bank, BNP Paribas, paid $8 billion because the U.S. Department of Justice find out that they have some deal with Sudan and Iran. So even if you are more attractive regarding prices, you can't be attractive when your operation can be threatened by the American Justice Department.
Indeed.
I think there is a real volunteer by European countries to try to save the deal and to try to encourage oil companies to import Iranian oil. However, oil companies here doesn't want to import that oil up to the crisis of GCP oil was solved with the United States, and that is actually the only way to move forward.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate Anas, Cyril and Alessandro for their time today and of course for their expert insight on this very important topic and certainly the challenges to this Iranian proposal for a pipeline to stretch from Iran all the way to Syria and possibly even beyond to supply possibly Europe or other markets beyond that even, is filled with challenges, considering, of course, the geopolitical implications and the realities on the ground and in the region. Iran and the U.S. obviously have never gotten along since the revolution of 1979, but at this time, specifically around the Strait of Hormuz, which is a vital waterway for the world's energy supplies, those tensions are only heightened at this time, even though there has been some effort by regional countries along with Iran to de-escalate some of those tensions. We'll keep a very close eye on whether this pipeline ever really comes to fruition, or whether Iraq will really play ball at this time. It's wanted nothing to do with the tensions between Iran and the U.S. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss two cases in this segment of Scope. Firstly, an incoming 17-year-old Palestinian Harvard freshman was detained and deported from the United States because of posts on social media, not that he had put up, but his friends had put up, which were, some of them at least, according to the reports that have come out, were critical of U.S. policies worldwide. The student himself didn't have any such political posts and insisted that they had nothing to do with him, but yet he was deported back to Lebanon from where he had come in. Secondly, we're going to discuss also the G7 summit, and there have been concerns raised about how journalists and activists were treated there. Some NGOs were blocked, some chose not to take part in the G7 in any form because, again, they felt that they were repressed in some fashion. One reporter even asked French police, and I thought this quote was quite an important one, "Isn't the press free in your country?" Let's discuss both of these cases a bit further, and just about freedom of speech in general, and whether that is coming down or eroding in parts of the West, at least. We're now joined by David Andelman, who is a political commentator. He's a journalist as well, author and former correspondent. He's joining us now from New York. And we're also joined by Robbie Travers, who is a government advisor. He works with the Gatestone Institute and is a political consultant as well. He's joining us now from London. Robbie and David, thank you both for your time today. David, I wanted to start with you, and I want to firstly talk about this case of the Palestinian freshman who came in to join Harvard University. He was brought in, I believe, on a scholarship as well. What are your thoughts about how that case played out?
Well, not very good, but I think fairly typical of what's going on these days in the United States, unfortunately. He showed up at Boston's Logan Airport earlier this week, expecting to enter and to begin his work as a freshman at Harvard. Classes begin on Tuesday, so September 3rd. He was on time. He was won admission, which is an extraordinarily difficult task, particularly for students from overseas where English may not be their first language. But he was apparently very capable and really quite impressive as far as the Harvard people are concerned. He was granted admission. He was granted a scholarship. He got on a plane. He came here. He had a visa, a valid visa to the United States, and he was turned back because of some issues that were found on his laptop and his cell phone, which officials at American immigration officials at Logan Airport seized on his arrival. Yeah. They apparently didn't like the looks of him or some such, even though he clearly had admissions to Harvard and had a valid visa. So the question now is, where do we go? I assume that is your next question, yes. Right?
Yeah, definitely. Because, Robbie, I wanted to bring you in on this as well, because for many of us, and I don't want to make this just an issue of Islamophobia or otherwise, but for many of us Muslims, when we do travel around the world, this sort of thing is always at the back of our minds, that we will be denied entry somewhere or the other, simply because of the fact that we are Muslim, or somebody will not like the look of us, or somebody will find a social media post that we may have put up, or somebody who's connected to us may have put up, which may be critical of U.S. policies, legitimate or otherwise. Do you think that's what is at the root of this case in the U.S.? And isn't that troubling? Isn't that disturbing?
Oh, this is very, very, very disturbing. And I'll tell you why this is very disturbing. This is someone who's not even been convicted of something they've said. It's something other people have said, which is frankly Orwellian and really disturbing, because at no point should this gentleman have been disallowed any entry to the country for his own views, which were, he should have been entitled himself to have criticized US foreign policy. US foreign policy is incredibly influential, but it must be free to discuss. But the fact is, he was detained for comments that other people had made. That should frighten anyone who believes in individual responsibility and free speech, regardless of what part of the political spectrum you're on.
Yeah. So then, David, I'm connecting this to the G7 case because, I find that it's disturbing, isn't it? Whenever we have these sorts of meetings, be it G20 or G7, and, a number of years ago, the meeting that took place in Toronto in Canada was also criticized for police's heavy-handed crackdown on protesters and activists. And, we know that whenever these sorts of summits happen, there will be protests. And of course, people are free to protest specifically in those countries, G7 or otherwise. What do you make of the fact that this time around, again, this has happened in France, in a country where Macron is speaking about how, how liberal he is, how he respects freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. The trend isn't a good one, is it?
No, it's certainly not. But it's interesting. Macron has gone through some very difficult times, let's face it, between the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, and so on. This has been a very difficult 6 months, 8 months for him. So to a degree, you can, I guess, give him a little bit of space to him for that. But there's no excuse in terms of prohibiting free speech. What is interesting at Biarritz, and I've been following this very carefully for other networks, I'm afraid, by times when the G7 go back to the 1970s when it was first at Versailles. What's interesting is they did allow protests there, but far enough away in another town nearby Biarritz that none of the actual heads of state, heads of government would actually be able to see these protesters. So the protests were fairly futile. There is no question that in any country, whether it's the United States, whether it's France, whether it's Pakistan, any democratic nation, people should be allowed to protest. And it's very interesting. Apparently, there are issues like that beginning to rise even in Moscow. In Russia, Putin is under some considerable pressure. There have been protests there. There have been more protests there, in fact, than in probably 20 years in the last couple of months. So this concept of being able to express oneself publicly is a very important part of the body politic, whether it's sometimes even in an autocratic country like Russia, but certainly it should be part of the DNA of a country like France or Britain or the United States.
Indeed. And on that point then, Robbie, you're sitting in the UK. I can only imagine the protests that are occurring there for and against Brexit as it may possibly be playing out there. But, just going back to the example of France and, Macron, he had been criticized from day one for being out of touch with the people anyways, wasn't he? Because he was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a banker before coming into this role. And, everyone said he was too elitist anyhow. And this sort of just proves that point, doesn't it? Where a lot of these leaders may feel at some level that they're above necessarily being impacted by protests or, having to face protests of any of these sorts and having to listen to, be it legitimate or otherwise, complaints that may be coming towards them. And, I take David's point, of course, about the Yellow Vest movement, and that certainly did have some violence, but even in that, there were some legitimate concerns, weren't there?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think that one of the greatest problems with the Yellow Vest movement has been actually that it has the response to the Yellow Vest movement has been so authoritarian, so extreme, and actually quite vicious. I don't know. There's multiple videos on the internet of women being pepper sprayed, of disabled people being thrown to the ground. And these things actually create such resentment against the police that what you see really is a backlash that is so extreme that the entire situation escalates, actually. It fuels the protests, but not in a healthy way. It becomes then more of a conflict rather than a political message protest. But, I think there's been a real erosion of rights to protest across the EU. Looking back to Catalonia even, where we've seen people arrested for waving a flag of an independence movement. That's a completely legitimate political protest. That should not be in any way disallowed. And yet you saw people arrested for it. People arrested for trying to vote even though it was constitutionally disputed, but people arrested for campaigning in a referendum and a political campaign. And we're starting to see this across the EU with people being arrested for tweets they've liked or campaigns. And it is really, really, really quite concerning, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, because it's affecting both sides. And it really can't be allowed to happen.
David, I'll give you the final word. And, you've been in this business for very long, David, in geopolitics and global politics in general. I wonder what your thoughts are about what all of this then means going forward. I'm going to go back to the question that you alluded to in your first answer. What does this mean going forward? And I'm looking to the West simply because, of course, the West, free speech and otherwise is spoken of as being the best, or at the best level, or the highest levels, if I may put it that way, within the Western world. Is that now being eroded? Why is that happening, do you think? And will that trend be reversed at some point in time?
I just want to correct one perhaps misconception from Robbie before I go on to that, which is an excellent question. Sure. I have an apartment in Paris, and I was right in the middle of the beginning of the Yellow Vest movement last fall. We had a barricade burned in front of our apartment building. The vast bulk of Yellow Vest protesters had legitimate, reasonable issues to raise with the government. But there were a number of these so-called casseurs, the breakers, who came in who were nothing more than hooligans. These were the people who police were really targeting. Some of the traditional Yellow Vest movement protesters got caught in the middle of this. It wasn't always quite, shall we say, so clear-cut. Okay. In terms of the future going forward, look, the president of Harvard, Lawrence Bacow, I have a letter that he's written to, he wrote this actually in July to Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Homeland Security. And he said, look, we need to figure out how to operate on this because we are a worldwide institution of higher learning, and all American institutions of higher learning, such as ours, may be faced with issues like this in the future. We need to find a way to really project our own democratic values throughout the world, and at the same time, of course, protect citizens of the United States. Yeah. Obviously, this is tilted way too far toward protection and too far from democracy, and that's the problem.
Indeed. Well, David and Robbie, we'll leave it there at that, but of course, sincerely appreciate your time today and, of course, for your insight on this important issue. I don't mean to overstate, certainly, but as we've spoken about with our guests, it does seem the Western world is having a hard time at this point in time in certain places when it comes to free speech. Why would a 17-year-old Palestinian who's gotten into Harvard, who's done everything right and by the book, gotten the scholarship, has not put up any political posts, even though he has the right to, as a global citizen, put up a political post, even critical of U.S. foreign policy or U.S. domestic policy or otherwise, as a citizen of the world, as I said, but yet he's being denied entry into the country because of friends' political posts. That at least is the report that has come out, if that is to be believed and if that is authentic. Then we, of course, have how French police and French authorities acted when it comes to the G7 protests. Those protests occur every time there is such a summit, and they certainly have the right to protest. And global leaders must hear their legitimate grievances. Again, is it right that they were only given a town far from Biarritz or another town altogether where these leaders wouldn't even see the protests? Does that make sense? And again, in a Western world which claims that it respects free speech and listens to the people. Again, not listening to the people. We'll keep a very close eye on how all of that develops in the coming days, especially, of course, this case of the 17-year-old Palestinian who is trying to now fight the system and get back into Harvard in time to join his classes, as David said. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.